The biting wind off Lake Michigan was nothing compared to the chill that ran down Arthur's spine when he saw his house, dark, silent, and completely lifeless at 7 p.m. The taxi driver, a burly man with a thick Chicago accent, pulled the yellow cab up to the curb, idling the engine. "You sure this is it, buddy? Looks like nobody's home." "It's the right place," Arthur Vance said, his voice raspy from the dry air of the airplane cabin. He handed the driver a $20 bill, telling him to keep the change. It was a generous tip for a short ride from the shuttle drop-off, but Arthur was a man who believed in treating workers well. He'd spent 30 years delivering mail through rain and snow, after all. He knew the value of $1 and the ache of a long shift. He dragged his heavy suitcase out of the trunk, the wheels crunching against the thin layer of ice that had coated the driveway. It was late November in Oak Park, that gray transitional time after Thanksgiving when the festive pumpkins had started to rot and the Christmas lights hadn't quite gone up yet. But looking up and down the street, Arthur saw that the gables across the road had their warm porch lights on, and the Smiths 2 doors down had the blue glow of a television flickering in their window. Only the Vance house stood like a tomb, swallowed by shadows. Arthur frowned, adjusting his glasses. Before he left for Wisconsin 2 weeks ago to care for his sister, who had undergone hip surgery, he had given his daughter, Julia, very specific instructions. Keep the porch light on for security. Keep the thermostat at 72 degrees for your mother. Make sure Martha takes her pills at 6 p.m. sharp. Julia had rolled her eyes, smiling that polished, confident smile of hers, the smile of a top-tier real estate agent who could sell a crumbling shack as a fixer-upper opportunity. "Dad, I'm 36, not 12, she had said, smoothing down her designer blazer. "I can handle Mom. You just go and take care of Aunt Sarah. We'll be fine. We'll be fine." The words echoed in his mind as he fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from a gnawing anxiety he couldn't quite name. He shoved the key into the deadbolt and turned it. The mechanism clicked loudly in the silence. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, expecting to be hit by the smell of pot roast or the sound of the evening news. Instead, he was hit by a wall of freezing air. "Julia," he called out, dropping his suitcase in the foyer. The sound of it hitting the hardwood floor was startlingly loud. "Martha? I'm home early." Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Arthur reached for the light switch, but his hand froze midair. He could see his own breath misting in front of his face. He walked quickly to the hallway thermostat. The digital display was dark, but when he tapped it, the backlight flickered on. It read 58 degrees. The setting was switched to away. Why in God's name? Arthur muttered, panic beginning to prick at his chest. Why would Julia set the heat to away in the middle of an Illinois winter with her mother in the house? Martha had poor circulation. The cold made her joints ache terribly. He moved deeper into the house, flipping on lights as he went. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless. The counters were wiped clean. There were no dishes in the sink. He opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty, save for a carton of milk that had expired 3 days ago and a few withered apples. "Julia," he shouted again, louder this time. He ran up the stairs, his 66-year-old knees protesting the sudden exertion. He checked the master bedroom. Empty. The bed was made perfectly military tight, as if no one had slept in it for days. He checked the guest room where Julia was supposed to be staying. The closet was open, and it was empty. Her clothes, her suitcase, her makeup kit, all gone. Maybe she took Mom to her place, Arthur whispered to himself, trying to steady his racing heart. Maybe the furnace broke, and they went to the condo in the city. But that didn't explain the darkness. It didn't explain why nobody answered the phone when he called from the airport. He went back downstairs, his mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. He wandered into the living room, feeling like a stranger in his own home. That's when he noticed it. The door to the finished basement was shut. Usually, they kept that door cracked open to let the heat circulate down there, as Arthur had his workbench and old record collection in the basement. But now it was firmly closed. And as Arthur got closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a hasp screwed into the wood of the door and the frame, a shiny, brand-new metal fixture that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. And hanging from it was a heavy-duty master lock. Arthur stared at it, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. Why would there be a padlock on the inside of his house? Why would someone lock the basement from the outside? Then he heard it. Thump. It was faint, rhythmic, and desperate. Thump, thump. Hello. Arthur's voice cracked. He pressed his ear against the cold wood of the door. Thursday. The voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and weak, but was unmistakable. It was the voice of the woman he had loved for 40 years. Martha! Arthur screamed, slamming his fist against the door. Martha, I'm here. I'm here. He grabbed the padlock, pulling at it violently, but it held fast. He patted his pockets, looking for a key, but he knew he wouldn't have one. This lock was new. Julia must have installed it. Hang on, sweetheart. Hang on. He spun around and sprinted through the kitchen to the door connecting to the garage. He didn't even bother with the light switch. He knew exactly where his tools were. He stumbled over a bag of potting soil in the dark, skinning his shin, but he didn't feel the pain. He groped along the wall until his fingers closed around the cold steel of his crowbar. I'm coming, Martha. He ran back into the living room, adrenaline flooding his system, giving him the strength of a man half his age. He jammed the flat end of the crowbar behind a metal hasp and heaved with everything he had. Hurry. Snap. The wood of the door frame splintered. The screw popped out, pinging against the floor. He repositioned the bar and pulled again, grunting with effort. The second screw gave way, and the hasp clattered to the floor, swinging loosely on the lock. Arthur didn't wait. He ripped the door handle open. As the door swings open, a stench of sour sweat and ammonia hits him, and he sees a figure curled up at the bottom of the stairs, shivering violently in the dark. Arthur has just opened the door to a nightmare. Before we descend into the darkness to see what happened to Martha, I have a small request. If this story has you hooked and you want to see justice served, please drop the number 8 in the comments below to let me know you are here with us. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Dramain Revenge and hit that notification bell. We pour our hearts into these stories to inspire and inform you, and your support ensures you never miss a single twist. Now, take a deep breath and let's find out the unthinkable truth in Martha. Arthur's scream tore through the silent house as he scrambled down the wooden stairs, his knees hitting the concrete floor beside his trembling wife. She was curled into a tight fetal position on a thin, filthy rug that had been dragged from the laundry area. The basement was freezing, colder than the upstairs, a damp, bone-deep chill that seeped into the marrow. The air was thick with the acrid stench of urine and something sweet and rotting, like spoiled fruit. Martha, oh God, Martha, look at me. Arthur choked out, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid he might break her. Her silver hair, usually kept neat and trimmed, was matted and greasy. Her nightgown, the blue flannel one he had bought her for Christmas 2 years ago, was stained dark and clung to her skeletal frame. She blinked slowly, her eyes glassy and unfocused in the sudden beam of the overhead light Arthur had flicked on. She flinched away from him, letting out a low, animalistic whimper. It's me, sweetheart. It's Arthur. It's Arthur, he sobbed, pulling off his heavy wool coat and wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. Martha looked up, her cracked lips moving soundlessly for a moment before she whispered, Daddy, did I finish my chores? The question hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. She had regressed. The dementia, which had been a slow, manageable fog for the last 2 years, seemed to have swallowed her whole in the darkness of this basement. She didn't see her husband. She saw a ghost from her childhood. Yes, sweetie, you finished. Arthur wept, sliding his arms under her. She felt terrifyingly light, like a bird made of hollow bones. How long had it been since she ate? He gritted his teeth, adrenaline masking the strain on his back as he lifted her up. We're going upstairs now. We're getting out of here. He carried her up the stairs, one careful step at a time, whispering reassurances that she couldn't hear. When they reached the living room, he laid her gently on the sofa and scrambled for his phone. His fingers, usually dexterous enough to sort thousands of letters an hour, were clumsy and numb as he dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? My wife. I found my wife, Arthur stammered, his voice rising in panic. She's been locked in the basement. She's unresponsive. She's freezing. Please send someone. Sir, take a deep breath. Is she breathing? Yes, but barely. She's so cold. Okay, help is on the way. Don't give her anything to eat or drink yet. Just keep her warm. The next 10 minutes were a blur of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the snow in the front yard. 2 paramedics rushed in, bringing with them the smell of antiseptic and the crackle of radios. They worked with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, cutting away the soiled nightgown, wrapping Martha in thermal blankets. Pulse is thready, one paramedic muttered to his partner. Body temp is 93 degrees. Severe dehydration. We need to move. Now. Arthur tried to climb into the back of the ambulance with her, but a police officer gently held him back by the arm. Sir, I need you to ride up front or follow us in your car. We need room to work. I'm following, Arthur said, his voice hard. I'm not leaving her again. The drive to Rush Oak Park Hospital was a nightmare. Arthur's hands gripped the steering wheel, so tight his knuckles turned white. Every red light felt like an insult. All he could think about was the box of protein bars and water bottles he had left on the kitchen counter specifically for Julia to use as snacks for Martha. He hadn't checked the box before leaving the house, but he just knew. It was probably sitting there, unopened, gathering dust. At the ER, they wheeled Martha behind double doors, and Arthur was left in the waiting room with its harsh fluorescent lights and vending machines humming in the corner. He paced the linoleum floor, staring at his boots, which were still stained with the dust from the basement floor. An hour later, a doctor in blue scrubs emerged. He looked tired. Mr. Vance, how is she? Arthur rushed forward. She's stable, but critical, the doctor said gravely. We're treating her for severe hypothermia and dehydration. Her sodium levels are dangerously high. But Mr. Vance, we found pressure sores on her hips and signs of muscle atrophy. Based on the waste burns on her skin and her state of malnutrition, I have to ask, how long was she down there? Arthur felt the room spin. I was away. I was in Wisconsin for 2 weeks. My daughter, she was supposed to be watching her. The doctor's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew colder. 2 weeks. He wrote something on his clipboard. I see. Social Services has been notified, and there's a detective here who needs to speak with you. A detective? Standard procedure for cases of severe elder neglect, the doctor said, then turned and walked away. A man in a cheap suit and a loosened tie approached Arthur. He held a cup of hospital coffee and looked like he hadn't slept in a day. He flashed a badge. Mr. Vance. I'm Detective Miller, Oak Park PD Elder Abuse Unit. Arthur sank into a plastic chair, burying his face in his hands. I didn't do this. I swear to God, I didn't do this. I love her. Miller sat down opposite him, not aggressively, but with a quiet intensity. I saw the lock on the basement door, Mr. Vance. The patrol officers sent me a picture. That's a heavy-duty hasp, mounted on the outside. You don't put that there to keep a toddler out. You put that there to keep someone in. I didn't put it there. Arthur looked up, tears streaming down his face. I just got home from O'Hare. My flight landed at 5:30. Check the airline records. I trusted my daughter, Julia. She's a real estate agent. She's successful. She promised me. Miller studied Arthur's face. He had seen a lot of liars in his 20 years on the force. He knew the look of a guilty man trying to spin a story. But Arthur Vance looked shattered. He looked like a man whose entire world had just been burned to the ground. Tell me about your daughter, Miller said, pulling out a small notebook. Where is she now? I don't know, Arthur whispered. Her phone goes to voicemail. Her clothes are gone from the guest room. The house. She turned heat off, detective. Who turns the heat off in November with their mother inside? Miller stopped writing. He looked up sharply. She turned the heat off? The thermostat was set to away. 58 degrees. Miller closed his notebook. The calculation in his eyes shifted. This wasn't just neglect. Neglect was lazy. Neglect was forgetting to feed someone. Turning off the heat, installing a padlock, leaving a confused woman in a concrete basement, that was something else. That was malice. Mr. Vance. Miller leaned in, his voice dropping an octave. We need to verify your timeline, but if what you're saying is true, we are looking at something much more serious than abandonment. I need to ask you a very specific question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Arthur nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Before you left for Wisconsin, Miller asked, did you sign over power of attorney to your daughter? No, Arthur said firmly. Absolutely not. I handle all our finances. Julia asked about it a few times, said it would be easier in case of an emergency, but I always said no. Miller's jaw tightened. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. The sympathy was gone, replaced by the sharp hunting instinct of a cop who just found the scent. "Mr. Vance, we need to check your accounts immediately. This wasn't just neglect. This looks like a calculated setup." The hospital waiting room coffee tasted like burnt rubber, but it was the only thing keeping Arthur upright as he logged into his mobile banking app with shaking fingers. It was 1 a.m. Martha had finally fallen into a restless, medicated sleep in the ICU. Detective Miller had left to file an emergency warrant for the house, advising Arthur to go home, get some rest, and look for any financial documents that might help the investigation. Rest was impossible, but answers? Arthur needed answers. He tapped the screen to open his primary savings account, the one he and Martha had built over 40 years. Every overtime shift at the post office, every skipped vacation, every penny pinched was in that account. It was their safety net for Martha's care facility when the time came. Loading. The screen refreshed. Balance, $0. Arthur stopped breathing. He stared at the number, blinking, hoping it was a glitch. He refreshed the page. Balance, $0 last transaction. Wire transfer to Thornhill Capital LLC, $185,000 pending. He swiped frantically to his checking account. Overdrawn by $500. He checked the mortgage status. A new notification popped up. "Congratulations on your HELIC approval. $120,000 disbursed to J. Vance." "Oh my God," Arthur whispered, the phone slipping from his sweaty palm onto his lap. A memory flashed in his mind. Thanksgiving last year. Gavin, his son-in-law, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon that Arthur hadn't bought. "Crypto is the future, Art. You're letting your money rot in a savings account earning 0.1% interest. You need to leverage your assets. Be smart." Arthur had told him no. He had told him he preferred safety over smart. Evidently, Gavin and Julia had decided to be smart for him. Arthur stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He couldn't stay here. He needed to go home. The police had cleared the scene, but Miller had said he could return to pack a bag for Martha. The drive back to the silent, cold house was a blur. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw a light on in the house across the street. As soon as Arthur stepped out of his car, the front door of the opposite house opened. Mrs. Gable, their neighbor of 20 years, hurried across the icy street, wrapped in a thick bathrobe and clutching a covered dish. "Arthur!" "Oh, thank heavens," she called out, her breath puffing in the night air. "I saw the ambulance earlier. Is everything all right?" "I brought a tuna casserole just in case." Arthur looked at the kindly old woman, confused. "Mrs. Gable, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I know I couldn't sleep. I've been so worried since Julia told me." Arthur froze. "Told you what?" Mrs. Gable hesitated, clutching the casserole dish tighter. "Well, about Martha moving. Julia came over the day after you left for Wisconsin. She gave me a lovely bottle of wine and said that you two had decided to move Martha to that luxury memory care facility in Florida immediately. She said it was a surprise for you too." Arthur felt the bile rise in his throat. "Florida?" "Yes. She said that's why the house was dark, to save on electricity while she packed everything up. We even signed a good luck card for you too. We thought you were already down there with her." It was a master stroke of lies. Julia hadn't just hidden Martha. She had erased her from the neighborhood. She had turned their friends into unwitting accomplices. "She lied, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Martha wasn't in Florida. She was in the basement." Mrs. Gable dropped the casserole. The ceramic dish shattered on the driveway, tuna and noodles splattering onto the snow. "What?" "Please," Arthur said, stepping over the mess. "I need to go inside." He left her standing there, hand over her mouth in horror, and unlocked his front door. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He felt only a burning, focused purpose. He went straight to the kitchen. On the island, sitting innocently next to the fruit bowl, was a silver MacBook. Julia's laptop. She had left it. Of course she had. In her mind, her father was an old, tech-illiterate mailman who used a flip phone until 2015. She probably thought he wouldn't even know how to turn it on, let alone crack it. Arthur opened the lid. The screen glowed to life, asking for a password. Arthur didn't guess. He didn't need to. He walked over to the refrigerator. Stuck to the side with a magnet from a pizza place was a sticky note in Julia's handwriting. Wi-Fi, Oak Park Home/pass, Julia Gavin 2023. He typed Julia Gavin 2023 into the laptop login box. Access granted. Arrogance, Arthur muttered. She always was arrogant. He clicked on the mail icon. The inbox was full of unread messages, but the top one sent just 4 hours ago caught his eye. Subject, booking confirmation, tap Air Portugal. Arthur clicked it. It was a receipt for 2 one-way tickets from Chicago O'Hare to Lisbon. First class. Passenger, Julia Vance passenger. Gavin Smith departure, today 8 a.m. Arthur glanced at the clock on the microwave. 2:15 a.m. They weren't just stealing the money. They were fleeing the jurisdiction. Portugal. He remembered hearing on the news something about extradition treaties, or the lack of them. He opened the next email from a Thornhill capital. Transfer received $305,000, total pooled assets. Funds converted to Bitcoin. Wallet key sent a secondary device. Good luck in Europe. They had liquidated everything. The savings, the helic, probably even maxed out his credit cards. They were taking 40 years of his life and flying away with it in 6 hours. Arthur grabbed his phone. He didn't tremble this time. He dialed Detective Miller's number from the card the officer had given him. Miller, the voice answered on the second ring, groggy but alert. Detective, Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the flight time. You need to get to O'Hare. Now, Mr. Vance, what did you find? They aren't just thieves, Detective. They are running. I have their flight itinerary. They leave for Lisbon at 8 a.m. And they have every dime I own in a crypto wallet. There was a rustle of sheets on the other end, then the sound of feet hitting the floor. I'm calling the Port Authority and Highway Patrol. Stay put, Arthur. I'm coming to pick you up. We're going to the airport. Arthur closed the laptop. I'm ready. They have the money, and they're about to board a flight to freedom. The chase is on. If you are outraged by this betrayal and want to see Arthur stop them in time, please drop the number 1 in the comments below to let me know you're still watching. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dramain Revenge and turn on that notification bell right now. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these gripping stories of justice every single day. We can't do it without you. Now, the clock is ticking. Let's head to the airport. The flashing lights of the squad car reflected off the icy highway as Detective Miller's voice crackled over the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Alpha. We are en route to O'Hare, Terminal 5. Requesting Port Authority intercept for 2 suspects attempting to board TAP Air Portugal Flight 204 to Lisbon. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle above the door. The siren wailed, cutting through the early morning silence of the I-290 expressway. It was 5 a.m., and the Chicago traffic was already beginning to thicken with trucks and early commuters, but the sea of red taillights parted reluctantly for the speeding police interceptor. We're going to make it, Arthur, Miller said, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his face illuminated by the strobing blue lights. Flight doesn't board until 7:15. We have time. They have priority check-in, Arthur muttered, staring out at the blur of snow-covered embankments. First class. They won't be standing in the regular line. He closed his eyes, and an image flashed in his mind, not of the basement, but a coat. Last Christmas, Julia had come to dinner wearing a magnificent, floor-length camel hair coat. She had spun around, laughing, saying it was a bonus from a big sale. Now, Arthur realized with a sickening lurch in his gut, he had paid for that coat. He had paid for it with the money meant for Martha's nursing care. If they get on that plane, Arthur said, his voice low, I'll never see a dime of that money again. And Martha? They aren't getting on the plane, Miller promised, swerving around a slow-moving delivery truck. The approach to O'Hare International Airport was a chaotic maze of concrete ramps and blinding lights. Miller bypassed the regular drop-off lanes, mounting the curb near the International Terminal entrance. 2 Port Authority officers were already waiting there, their breath visible in the frigid air. Miller killed the siren. Stay close to me, Mr. Vance. Point them out, but let us handle the physical contact. Understood. Understood. They burst through the automatic revolving doors into the warmth of Terminal 5. The terminal was already buzzing with the noise of rolling suitcases, crying babies, and announcements in multiple languages. It was a world away from the cold, silent tomb of Arthur's basement. Here, people were going on vacations, business trips, honeymoons. Tap Air Portugal check-in is at aisle 3, Miller said, checking his phone. Let's move. Arthur jogged to keep up with the detective's long strides. His heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. He looked for Gavin's slick back hair. He looked for Julia's perfect posture. They reached aisle 3. The economy line snaked back and forth, filled with tired travelers. But the priority lane was empty, save for a couple at the counter, handing over their passports. The woman was wearing a camel haircut. Arthur stopped dead. That's her, he choked out, pointing. That's Julia. Julia stood at the counter, looking every inch the successful executive. She was laughing at something the check-in agent said, her hand resting possessively on a stack of Louis Vuitton luggage. Gavin stood beside her, tapping furiously on his phone, looking bored. They looked untouchable. They looked like they had one. Miller signaled the 2 uniformed officers. They moved in a pincer formation, flanking the counter. Julia Vance. Gavin Smith. Miller's voice boomed across the terminal, silencing the nearby chatter. Julia froze. She turned slowly, her smile dropping like a stone. When she saw the badges, her face went pale, but when she saw her father standing behind them, disheveled and wearing yesterday's clothes, her eyes widened in genuine shock. Dad, she stammered. What are you doing here? Step away from the counter, Miller ordered, hand resting on his holster, not drawing, just ready. Put your hands where I can see them. Excuse me? Julia's shock instantly morphed into indignation. She drew herself up, channeling all her professional arrogance. Do you know who I am? We have a flight to catch. This is harassment. You're under arrest for elder abuse, unlawful confinement, and financial exploitation of the elderly, Miller recited, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked ominously. Turn around. Now. Gavin looked up from his phone, his face draining of color. He looked from the police to Julia, and then to the exit. Don't even think about it, son, one of the uniformed officers said, stepping into Gavin's path. This is ridiculous. Julia screeched as Miller grabbed her wrist. The people in line were staring, phones out, recording the scene. My father is confused. He has dementia. He doesn't know what he's saying. Dad, tell them. Tell them you're confused. Arthur stepped forward. The crowd parted for him. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the little girl he had raised, but a stranger fueled by greed. I'm not confused, Julia, Arthur said, his voice steady and cutting through the noise of the terminal. I'm awake. I saw the basement. I saw the lock. Dad, please, Julia's voice cracked, shifting tactics instantly from anger to manipulation. Tears welled up in her eyes, fake, calculated tears. We were doing it for you. We were investing the money to help you. It was a surprise. You left your mother in a freezing basement with a bucket for a toilet, Arthur said, his voice trembling with emotion. You left her to die so you could fly first class. Miller snapped the cuffs onto Julia's wrists. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the reality of the situation hit them, Gavin, the tech genius, panicked. As the officer grabbed his arm, he recoiled, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. It was her idea, Gavin shouted, his voice high and desperate. I have the emails. She planned it all. She forged the power of attorney. I just did what she told me. Julia spun around, struggling against Miller's grip. You coward. You spineless leech. I have the crypto keys. Gavin yelled at the police, ignoring her. I can give you the money back. Just don't charge me. It was all her. That's enough. Miller barked. Get them out of here. Arthur watched as his daughter and son-in-law were marched away in handcuffs, still screaming accusations at each other. The camel hair coat, the symbol of her status, was bunched up awkwardly around her restrained arms. The airline agent behind the counter looked at Arthur, wide-eyed. Sir, do you want me to cancel these tickets? Arthur looked at the 2 boarding passes sitting on the counter. Yes, he said softly. Cancel them. Nobody is going to Portugal today. He turned to follow Detective Miller. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him exhausted, but for the first time in 24 hours, the crushing weight on his chest felt a little lighter. They had caught them. Now he had to face the hardest part, telling Martha why her daughter wouldn't be coming to visit. 6 months later, the Cook County courthouse was packed, not because of the amount of money stolen, but because of the sheer cruelty of a daughter locking away her own mother. Outside, Chicago was baking in a July heat wave, the asphalt shimmering at 95 degrees. But inside courtroom 302, the air conditioning was blasting, keeping the atmosphere frigid, a chilling reminder of the cold basement where this nightmare had begun. Arthur adjusted his tie. It felt tight against his throat. He sat behind the prosecutor's table, looking at the back of his daughter's head. Julia was sitting with her defense attorney, wearing a modest gray cardigan and glasses she didn't need. She had dyed her hair back to its natural brown and wore no makeup. It was a costume, Arthur knew. She was playing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed caregiver. Gavin wasn't there. True to his cowardly nature at the airport, he had taken a plea deal months ago. He was already serving a 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility in exchange for testifying against his wife. He had sung like a canary, handing over every email, every text message, every crypto key. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison entered, her robes billowing. The jury filed in 12 ordinary citizens who looked serious and grim. The trial had been going on for 3 days, but today was the day that mattered. Today was the defense's closing argument and the verdict. Julia's lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Sterling, stood up. He walked over to the jury box, his voice soft and sympathetic. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling began, gesturing to Julia, who wiped a non-existent tear from her eye. You see a criminal. I see a daughter who was drowning. Caring for a parent with dementia is the hardest job in the world. Julia Vance wasn't trying to hurt her mother. She was panicked. She made bad choices under extreme stress. She locked that door to keep her mother from wandering off and hurting herself. And yes, she took the money, but she intended to invest it to pay for better care later. This wasn't malice, it was desperation. A few jurors nodded sympathetically. The caregiver's stress narrative was powerful. It played on everyone's fear of aging parents. Arthur felt a surge of anger, but he stayed silent. He knew what was coming next. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ms. Chen, stood up. The people call Arthur Vance to the stand for rebuttal. Arthur walked to the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. He looked out at the gallery, seeing Mrs. Gable and half the neighborhood sitting there in support. Mr. Vance, Ms. Chen asked, the defense claims your daughter intended to use the money for your wife's care. Is that your understanding? No, Arthur said clearly. Why not? Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photocopy of a document. I worked for the postal service for 30 years. I learned to keep copies of everything. When I got back into my house, I found this in Julia's discard pile in her home office. He held up the paper. This is a letter Julia wrote to the Sunnyvale Memory Care Center, a facility Martha was on a waiting list for. It's dated 2 weeks before I left for Wisconsin. Ms. Chen took the letter and read it aloud to the stunned courtroom. To whom it may concern, please remove Martha Vance from your waiting list. We have decided to handle her care at home to save costs. Please refund the deposit to the account ending in 4092. The courtroom gasped. The account ending in 4092 was Julia's personal account. She didn't want to pay for care, Arthur said, his voice breaking slightly. She canceled the professional help so she could keep the money. That isn't stress. That's greed. Julia's head snapped up, her modest daughter mask slipping for a split second to reveal a flash of pure hatred. And regarding the basement, Ms. Chen continued, turning to the jury. The defense says the lock was for safety. Let's see what safety looks like. She nodded to the technician. The large screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. It was the body cam footage from the first responding officer, taken the night Arthur returned. The video was shaky and dark, illuminated only by flashlights. On screen, the wood splinters. The door swings open. The flashlight beam cuts through the darkness to reveal the bucket in the corner. The thin, soiled rug. And then Martha. The sound was the worst part. The audio picked up the low, rhythmic whimpering of a human being who had lost all hope. Daddy? Cold, so cold. In the courtroom, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A female juror in the front row covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Another juror looked away, unable to watch. Even the judge looked down at her bench pained. Arthur forced himself to watch. He owed it to Martha to witness her pain so that justice could be served. Ms. Chen paused the video on a freeze frame of Martha's bruised, terrified face. Julia Vance had a first-class ticket to Portugal in her purse, Ms. Chen said, her voice like steel. She left her mother in this basement not to keep her safe, but to keep her quiet. If Mr. Vance hadn't come home early, this wouldn't be a trial for abuse. It would be a trial for murder. She sat down. The silence in the room was deafening. Mr. Sterling, the defense attorney, didn't even bother to cross-examine. He knew it was over. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He didn't look at Julia. In the matter of the People versus Julia Vance, on the charge of aggravated elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of financial exploitation, guilty. On the charge of unlawful confinement, guilty. Count after count. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Julia put her head on the table and began to sob loud, ugly sobs. But this time, nobody in the courtroom felt sorry for her. Arthur closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He just felt a heavy, exhausting relief. The monster who had worn his daughter's face was gone. Martha was safe. As the bailiffs moved to handcuff Julia and lead her away for sentencing, she turned to look at her father one last time. "Dad," she wailed. "Dad, help me." Arthur stood up. He looked at her with a sadness that was deeper than the ocean. "I helped you your whole life, Julia," he said softly, though she couldn't hear him over the commotion. "I helped you so much you forgot how to be a human being." He turned his back on her and walked toward the gallery, where Mrs. Gable was waiting with open arms. The for sale sign that Arthur had feared he would have to hammer into the frozen front lawn was nowhere to be seen, thanks to a miracle he never expected. Instead, the front yard of the Vance home was decorated with illuminated plastic turkeys and a wreath made of autumn leaves hanging on the door. It was Thanksgiving again, exactly 1 year since Arthur had returned to a dark, cold house. But this year, the windows were glowing with golden light, and the chimney was puffing out cheerful white smoke. Inside, the house smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and pumpkin pie, the sense of life. Arthur stood in the kitchen, basting the bird. He moved a little slower these days. The stress of the trial and the long months of legal battles to secure guardianship over Martha had aged him. His hair was completely white now, and his shoulders stooped a bit more. But his hands were steady. "Arthur," a voice called from the living room. He put the baster down and wiped his hands on his apron. "I'm here, sweetie. Just checking the bird." He walked into the living room. Martha was sitting in her favorite recliner, knitted afghan tucked around her legs. She looked frail, yes, and her eyes still drifted sometimes, but she was clean. She was warm. Her hair was brushed and curled, and she was wearing a soft pink sweater that highlighted the color returning to her cheeks. "Is the parade on?" she asked, pointing at the TV. "It sure is," Arthur smiled, sitting on the armrest of her chair. "Look, there's Snoopy." She clapped her hands, a delight in her eyes that was pure and childlike. The terror of the basement, the darkness, the cold, it had all faded from her mind. The doctors said it was a blessing of the disease. Her brain had simply erased the trauma to protect itself. Arthur carried the weight of the memory for both of them. He looked around the room, his eyes resting on the framed photo on the mantelpiece. It wasn't a photo of Julia. He had taken those down months ago. It was a photo of the neighborhood block party from last summer. That was when the miracle had happened. After the trial, the financial reality had hit them. Julia and Gavin had spent or hidden most of the money. The bank wanted its loan payments. Arthur had been days away from listing the house, preparing to move Martha into a state-subsidized facility that smelled of bleach and despair. Then Mrs. Gable had knocked on the door. She hadn't brought a casserole that time. She had brought an iPad. "Arthur, look," she had said, tears in her eyes. She had started a GoFundMe page titled "Help Arthur and Martha Keep Their Home." She had shared their story, not the scandalous details of the crime, but the story of a mailman who had served his community for 30 years and his wife who always baked cookies for the school bake sales. The goal was $100,000. They had raised $145,000. Donations came from neighbors, from people on Arthur's old mail route, from complete strangers in other states who had read the story online. "My mom had Alzheimer's," one donor wrote. Nobody should go through that alone. They saved the house. They saved Martha's dignity. The family that Arthur thought he had lost in Julia was replaced by a family of hundreds of strangers who chose kindness over indifference. Martha tugged on his sleeve, pulling him out of his reverie. Yes, Martha? She looked at the dining table, which was set for 8 people. Is Julia coming for dinner? The room went silent, save for the low hum of the television commentary. This was the question Arthur dreaded. It came less often now, maybe once a month, but it still stung like a fresh wound. He looked at his wife. He could tell her the truth, that their daughter was in a federal prison in downstate Illinois, serving a 12-year sentence. He could tell her that Julia hadn't written a single letter of apology. He could tell her about the betrayal. But Arthur looked at Martha's fragile smile, the peace in her eyes that he had fought so hard to restore. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring, the only valuable thing Julia hadn't managed to steal. No, sweetheart, Arthur said softly. Julia is traveling. She's very far away on a long trip. She won't be back for a long time. Martha frowned for a second, a shadow passing over her face. Then she nodded. That's nice. She always liked to travel. I hope she's warm. Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm sure she is. Just then the doorbell rang, a bright, cheerful chime that echoed through the warm house. They're here, Martha exclaimed. Arthur walked to the front door. Through the frosted glass, he could see the silhouettes of people carrying dishes, pies, and bottles of wine. It was Mrs. Gable. It was the young couple from next door who shoveled Arthur's snow for free. It was Detective Miller, who had promised to stop by for a slice of pie. Arthur placed his hand on the doorknob. He paused for a moment, looking back at his wife, safe and happy in her chair. He realized then that he wasn't a victim. He was a survivor. And he was the richest man in Oak Park, not because of money, but because he knew the true value of loyalty. He opened the door wide, letting the crisp autumn air and the warmth of his community flood in. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone, Arthur said, smiling genuinely for the first time in a year. Come in, please. You're just in time. As Arthur opened his door to the neighbors, he realized that true family isn't defined by blood, but by who holds your hand when the winter comes. While greed might promise a life of luxury, it leaves the soul bankrupt. Only kindness and unconditional love can turn a cold house back into a warm home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you love and subscribe to Dramain Revenge. Let's build a community that, just like Arthur's neighbors, always looks out for one another.